It is hard to believe just how little training the mobilized Russians are getting before they're sent to Ukraine. There's been a lot of speculation about this, but today we're going to look at kind of a rough training timeline, at least according to Putin. So to do that, we're going to look at an article, a transcript really, where Putin was answering questions from the media. Doesn't do this a lot. And I know people have different stances on this, whether or not we should pay any attention to what Putin says. Personally, I think we should. Even if you think that somebody like Putin is going to lie 50, 80, 90, 100% of the time, whatever it might be, I want to know what they're, using their energy to lie about. Like, why are they lying about this, that, or the other thing? Whether it's true or not, the topics they choose to cover or how they address those topics, I think is important. So today we're going to look at a transcript. It's on the Kremlin website. They publish the translated transcripts for all of these different speeches and events that Putin goes to. I'll put a link to that in the video description so you can take a look if you want. But it's really going to be focused on the mobilization process. Since this mobilization kicked off, there were rumors like right away that some of these soldiers were being captured or found dead in Ukraine like less than a week later, days later, which is crazy. The process of even getting somebody from their house, putting them in a uniform and moving them to Ukraine should take days. So if they're found in Ukraine days or weeks later, that likely means they had zero training. Articles like this started to come out saying my son has died. Russia mourns loss of first drafted soldiers in Ukraine. And what's challenging with this subject is the information and reporting. It's kind of all over the place, right? This wouldn't look good for Russia, so they're not going to necessarily present this exact same information as much as Western sources will want to highlight these types of things. And in this type of incident, it's hard to tell, is that soldier that was found dead in Ukraine a few days after mobilization, was that the anomaly or was that the norm? Very, very, very challenging to pick apart from here in the United States. Another aspect worth considering with all of this is I was starting to see some reporting, one of which is pulled up here, that, and I don't know how accurate this is, but it makes sense. It checks out, passes the common sense test, that when Russians were captured, they would pretend to be conscripts, thinking that that would get them better treatment. Maybe they'd be viewed as somebody who didn't want to fight the war and they were forced essentially at gunpoint to go fight on behalf of Russia and they didn't want to be there. So POWs or wounded soldiers were claiming to be conscripts, claiming to be this recent mobilized group, when in reality they weren't. So there's probably some of that in there. All of that to say the exact details of what's going on in the battlefield are always difficult to parse apart. But we're going to move down to the transcript here. The question asked by Gleb, man, I'm going to butcher that, I know it, Ivanov here. And I'm going to kind of bounce through the question a little bit. Mr. President, a follow-up question about mobilization. The first deaths of mobilized soldiers have been reported. Remember, this was on October 14th. Several mobilized men have died. A Moscow government employee who was mobilized on September 23rd is being buried in Moscow today. He had no military training or military experience. The question is, how is this possible? How did people end up on the front line and die before even 3 weeks had passed since the mobilization was announced? And Putin's a politician, so he bounces around a little bit, answers a different question. But then he gets to that. All citizens who are called up as part of this mobilization must undergo training, which is provided as follows. I said that 222,000 people are now in the Army. There was a previous question. He was getting into how many had been mobilized. More precisely, the formation units where they receive initial training that lasts from 5 to 10 days. Then, depending on the military specialty, they go to combat units for training for a period of 5 to 15 days. The next step is training with troops involved in combat operations where they undergo joint combat training. That last part, that sounds like they're going out to frontline units and they're kind of learning on-the-job training, is what that sounds like to me. Could be wrong, but when they're going to units that are involved in combat operations, that's baptism by fire. That's not what we in the United States have advanced individual training. It's done stateside at training locations well before they even get to the unit. This seems much more advanced. Seems like a fancy way of saying on-the-job training. But what caught my eye here was the initial training from 5 to 10 days. So if you remember when this mobilization was announced, and this is another one where there's a lot of speculation about how this is actually panned out, the reporter here just said that this man had no previous military training. That was supposed to be one of the terms of this mobilization, was they were only going to veterans, essentially. So this would be a refresher training. Even if it is, let's say it is a refresher training, 5 to 10 days to get somebody who may not have worn a uniform for 5, 10, 20 years and get them ready for combat is insane. This person the reporter called out, who has no previous military experience, let's put them on the long end here, 25 days total, maybe, before they get to their first unit. So as a comparison, not that the United States does everything perfect or we have the best method, but currently basic training in the United States is around 10 weeks. So 10 weeks, that's not counting the advanced training that a soldier will get for their specific MOS, commo, infantry, artillery, helicopter maintenance, whatever it is. That's not counting that. This is basic soldier skills. And this also doesn't count the training they get once they go to their unit. It's 25 days to 10 weeks is the comparison here. Now, we'll give Russia the benefit of the doubt and look at the other side of this and say these are people with prior military experience, so it's more of a train-up rather than, starting from scratch. Again, the reporter said this person had no military experience, so that very well could be happening. But even if they are pulling veterans or people who have worn the uniform in the past, let's look at what that 5 to 10 days of initial training might actually look like. As a comparison, again, we'll pull up the TC 3-20.40. It's a manual here in the United States talking about individual weapons qualification or all weapons qualification. But we're going to look at the individual side. If you look at the individual weapon system, M4, for instance, we have this table here talking about the different tables that we push through. This is for people who are in the military. So like I'm clean shaven because I just got back from reserve training this weekend. So when a reserve unit that wears a uniform once a month even goes through a qualification, we're supposed to do it in this amount of time. When an active duty unit is supposed to do it in this amount of time, it's, doing math on the fly here, 1, 2, 3, 4.5 days just to get through your weapons qualification, your M4 weapons qualification. That doesn't count somebody that qualifies an M4 and then a machine gun and then a grenade launcher or an artilleryman that has to move on to those systems. 4.5 days just for your individual weapon system. Nothing else. So think of these Russian soldiers that are spending on the low side 5 days before they're essentially heading off to a combat unit to get trained up. What are they doing? That's enough time to receive a uniform, pick up a weapon, maybe get the gear that fits correctly, hopefully, because there's not enough time to swap it out if it doesn't, and head out to the front lines. I have said this in the past. I hoped that wasn't the case, because regardless of the cause, regardless of why somebody is fighting, regardless of the war, regardless of the side, forcing somebody into a combat situation with inadequate training is criminal in my mind. That it's one thing if somebody picks up their weapon and decides they want to fight, they want to stand and defend their home, or they want to go off to a foreign land and fight, and they make that decision consciously themselves. That's on them. But when a government forces somebody into a combat situation where in 5 days they definitely haven't zeroed a weapon and learned how to apply a tourniquet and pack a wound and call a medevac or any of these, like there's very, very basic combat skills that just won't be covered in that period that will cost people their lives. In my mind, no matter the side, no matter the reason, that's criminal and sad. It's a waste of human life. So again, Putin, 5 to 10 days of training, maybe a little bit more advanced training depending on the special skill. But at this point, recording this on October 17th, 2022, a couple days after this speech was given or this article came out, that is little to no training for these mobilized soldiers. It sounds very similar to the comparisons made of World War II where people were given a rifle and off to the front. Not a lot has changed, I suppose. But that'll do it for now. Be back soon with more articles, topics, and conversations. Maybe about the war in Ukraine, maybe about something different. We'll have to see what comes up. We'll see you.